In 2007, veteran economic journalist Amity Shlaes gave a Bradley lecture at AEI on her new book, The Forgotten Man, A New History of the Great Depression. Amity Shlaes has agreed to join us at AEI again to discuss her best-selling book on the 30th President of the United States, Calvin Coolidge. In a riveting discussion with AEI resident scholar Michael Barone, Ms. Shlaes discusses the personalities and the policies of the Calvin Coolidge era.
Amity, why Coolidge? Your account of him suggests that he was underestimated at almost every stage in his career, and people didn't think that there was very much there.
That's right. People often said there wasn't much there, but Coolidge was a president and a politician who made an art of being underestimated. That was his trick. He would always deliver more than he promised or appeared to be able to deliver, and that surprised people and pleased them.
He started his career as elected to the Massachusetts legislature from Northampton, a small town in western Massachusetts. That was during the Progressive era, when the general assumption was that you wanted more government. Did Coolidge fight this from the start, or was his early part of his career in tune with the progressive impulse of the turn of the 20th century?
Oh, no, he was in tune. This book, Coolidge, is sort of the education of Calvin. He was mugged by reality over time to become a greater conservative. But when he started, Theodore Roosevelt was the star of his party. We even describe his honeymoon Coolidges with Theodore Roosevelt news intruding upon the honeymoon. And Theodore Roosevelt believed in reform, and so did Coolidge. He's a state progressive. At the state level, when you look at the Coolidge record, you'll see him backing things like trust busting even for theaters. That was one of his first pieces of legislation in the Massachusetts state legislature, the general court, but negotiating with unions all the time. But over time, Coolidge, two things happened. One is Coolidge decided that the progressive policy wasn't always good. And the other was he moved to the national government, and we want to recall that these people might be state progressives, but they weren't necessarily Washington progressives. Coolidge believed that progressive law should happen, but it was more appropriate at the state level, not the Washington level.
Coolidge was elected governor of Massachusetts in 1918, and he faced a big crisis that made him a national figure, the Boston police strike in September 1919. You described that, but also, what was the atmosphere of the time? I have this sense that there was a sense of revolution brooding. This is just after the Russian Revolution. I think you described this kind of vividly. Help us understand the atmosphere.
A very rough time, much worse than now. The demonstrations then made Occupy Wall Street look tame. The workers were angry, they were underemployed, prices were going up, but nobody was admitting there was inflation, which there was. And they were much inspired, having just come back from Europe, soldiers, right, by the Irish Revolution, Eamon Valera, or by Russia, or by Germany. And so the policemen of Boston went on strike, and they had every reason, they organized, joined the AFL and went on strike. They had every reason to believe that the governor, who by an idiosyncrasy of Massachusetts law was sort of in charge of the Boston police, would go along and conciliate with them because they hadn't affiliated with the Wobblies, the radical union. They were nice policemen. He was reliant. He needed the Irish vote to win re-election. His election was that autumn. They elected a governor every year in Massachusetts at that time. And Coolidge had conciliated with unions before. But when the policemen went on strike, there was chaos in Boston. Horses trampled, riots, shooting. It was terrible. And Coolidge and the police commissioner who reported to him did fire the policemen. And Coolidge uttered this famous statement, "There is no right to strike against public safety by anybody, anywhere, anytime."
He did that in a telegram to Samuel Gompers, the head of the AFL, American Federation of Labor. That's a fascinating little episode, but it made him a national figure, I gather.
Well, what I hadn't realized until writing this book was why precisely it made him a national figure. The reason it did was Wilson himself, the sitting president, was waffling over public sector unions and treatment of unions generally. A coal strike loomed. In those days, a coal strike meant it's cold in your apartment. right? It was a dire thing. And Wilson had counted on Gompers of AFL, the very man with whom the police of Boston were affiliating, in the war, and said, no strikes during the war, let's have labor peace, and we'll give you a raise. The country will give workers a raise afterwards. So Gompers was not just a union leader, he was like a statesman. And Gompers expected that this little governor of Massachusetts would conciliate. And when Coolidge moved against the police, he upstaged Wilson. He said, we in America, effectively, are not going to have this kind of public sector strike all the time. And Wilson, you can see it in the text, all of a sudden lined up behind Coolidge. And when a governor upstages a president, that means the governor is of national caliber. And the country rewarded him with recognition, and also recognition for doing this, Michael, because it's hard to fire policemen, but we need social calm in order to have commerce.
You have a picture of President Harding in this that's at odds with a lot of the standard histories where show him as kind of a buffoon and corrupt. Is Harding's bad reputation justified?
It is not. And Harding is failed because he was a slob, as Alice Roosevelt Longworth said. It's true. But he's not the trash, the way he's treated as trash in the history book. I think the whole policy of the Republican Party is worth going back to. The one thing you want to and looking at, and that includes Harding's policy, the one thing you want to remember about Coolidge, if you remember anything, is that when he left office in '29, the budget, the federal budget, was lower than when he came in after 67 months. And we consider that impossible now. A president could actually lower a budget. That policy had started with Harding. The Harding-Coolidge ticket was a ticket of saying no, of cutting back, and it was enormously popular.
Tell us a little about how Coolidge went about cutting the budget.
Well, Michael, before you mentioned the budget law, and the budget law of Harding gave Coolidge the tool. You know the timeline. Harding was president. He signed a new budget law, the Budget and Accounting Act of 1921. Then, alas, he passed. Coolidge came in and used that law. What did the law have? What was the tool? Because nobody can work without tools. What was this tool that no longer exists? This law gave the president complete oversight over the budget, whereas before different committees had come with laws and the president had signed, like mendicant children, one after the other.
As I understand it, there was no central in the executive branch that agency that actually kept track of all these things.
Right. It was just one child after another asking for money, and you feel nice on some days. Very arbitrary and unorganized. So the budget gave the president this authority, and it also gave him an office, the forerunner to the modern OMB, to do his own arithmetic so he could check and evaluate. And it gave him a couple other powers. One is he could basically impound money that was already written into law through a budget. So if a department was budgeted for 2 pencils, but it only used 1.5, the president could say, I'll take that stub back. I'll take that 0.5 back. I'll impound that, or ask you to give it back. I'll sequester things that are supposed to be words we don't even like to use now. They used routinely, and as a result, Coolidge was able to cut the budget.
When Coolidge became president after President Harding's death, sudden death, in August 1923, Republicans had relatively narrow margins in the Congress, and as a result of the 22 off-year elections. And there were demands in the Republican Party for new programs on 2 major issues: the veterans bonus for veterans of World War I, and farm legislation to compensate farmers for prices as they had been compensated during the World War I period. What was Coolidge's reaction to that? How did he respond?
Well, the myth about that period is, they didn't have entitlements, so there wasn't the pressure today. They had pressure for entitlements in that period, very strong, where I consider farming subsidy an entitlement, basically. So there was pressure for farming subsidy. The farms were in trouble. The prices were down, and there was intense pressure to help the vets. Remember, there was no Social Security then. So what the vets wanted was arguably good. They wanted a pension. Well, 1/3 of the vets was disabled. There was no penicillin. They had these wounds that festered. Their wives didn't work. They were in trouble. So these are logical demands from constituent groups. And hard to say no to, but Coolidge and Harding before him did say no. They vetoed.
Tragedy struck the Coolidge family while he was in the White House, and at various times, as I read your narrative, this was a man who sounds depressed. We might even say had depression as vice president at various points before his marriage and things like that. Tell us something about how Coolidge copes with this.
Well, in modern psychology, when someone's depressed, we sort of excuse them and say, oh, they're less functional. Coolidge had many tragedies in his life, starting with the death of his mother as a child, his sister, terrible, needless diseases. His sister probably had appendicitis. She died as a teen. And in the White House, the Coolidges had 2 children. The couple lost their son, Calvin, who was the apple of their eye, a very lively, lovable child, just turned 16 from a tennis blister. He got a blister playing tennis on the White House court, and within 7 or 8 days was gone. So Coolidge, despite depression, it's not a psycho story. It's not a story of yes, comma, but. It's a story of but, yes, persevered notwithstanding these blows coming upon him.
We're told that the 1920s were a period of foreign policy isolationism. Is that an accurate description of President Coolidge's foreign policy?
So his principle was first, do no harm as a doctor, and that applied to foreign policy too. He was clearly disturbed by the arbitrary interventions in the tradition of Theodore Roosevelt. He could see that commerce was good and therefore the Panama Canal was necessary, but he probably didn't like the way Theodore Roosevelt took it. So you want to think about that, and he had been struck by the incredible waste of World War I. His entire life in the 1920s in Washington was about dealing with the waste and tragedy of World War I, the costs, and you can see from his calendar, which we looked at, how many foreigners he received, and with the debts of the foreign nations and so on. So he tended to think the U.S. should be smaller and live up to what it does promise, rather than over-promise and not deliver.
What were his thoughts? What do we know about what he thought about the Depression?
Well, he thought that the government should not intervene, but he also didn't know whether he personally would have the strength as president to stop the interveners.
Did you think Hoover was intervening, his successor?
Right, so that's, imagine his retirement. He knew something would come. He'd experienced, I think, 10 market crashes in his life, severe market crashes. The stock market was too high, and he kind of physically, emotionally didn't want to have to deal with that. He didn't think the president should stop the stock market going too high, but he knew there would be political pressure to react, and he withdrew from the idea of that because he didn't want to do what he didn't believe in.
Well, Amity, thank you very much, and congratulations on the best-selling status of your book, Coolidge.
Thank you.